Hello and welcome to the Institute of Early Years Education. My name is Sinead McMahon and I'm the Content Manager here at the Institute, and I'm joined today by one of our content writers, Emily Askew, who will be presenting alongside me today. Firstly, we'd just like to say thank you for joining us for this webinar. We know how precious your time is, but hopefully you'll feel the benefits of making some time today to watch this short webinar. We wanted to do this session focusing on temporary staff as at the time of recording we're heading into the winter season, which is a time traditionally where we're faced with additional staff absence due to seasonal illness. We know that when colleagues are absent in the workplace it can prove challenging, as regardless of their absence, the show must go on. Obviously, it's essential that we maintain the correct legal staff to child ratios in our settings. So of course, if usual staff members aren't available, then of course we will need to plug that gap in staffing in some way. It could be that you are able to cover the staff absence internally. You may have a manager or deputy manager who's not usually in ratio that can go and provide some temporary cover. Or if you have a number of part-time members of staff, you might be able to ask them to work additional hours. But if these options are unavailable, then it's likely that you'll need to reach out to a local agency to find some cover staff. And in this instance, we recognise that this can sometimes bring about a few challenges for some settings, so we just wanted to think about some of those in this session, whilst also considering some of the many opportunities when working with temporary staff, as well as offering some other recommendations. So firstly, who are temporary staff? Well, the majority of teams, as I've said, within our settings are made up on a permanent base of regular faces. They may work full-time in the same room or part-time across different areas of the setting, but generally they are employed with a greater number of hours and designated responsibilities. And contrary to the popular belief of many of the children we work with, we don't actually live in setting, and therefore there will be times when the children's preferred familiar faces may be off-site for a short period of time. We know that staff absences are inevitable. Staff will be absent for a whole different variety of reasons, such as sickness, annual leave, or other milestones, perhaps graduation or a house moving day. But taking time off work is a part of team management that should be supported, and for leaderships it should also be as stress-free as possible. In the ideal world, of course, staff absences would occur with some prior notice, for example, holiday periods. However, many absences, like I said before, will come about at the last minute, and they can be more of a challenge sometimes to cover. Temporary staff teams, otherwise known as a bank staff team or agency, supply staff, cover staff, are a really useful resource of staffing provision for when ratios do require additional staffing. And having solid and set procedures in place around any cover staff can alleviate the pressure of your permanent workforce. So someone taking time off for a holiday, for example, will be able to relax a lot more knowing that their role is being covered in their absence. And also for any permanent members of staff who remain in setting, it makes their job easier if we have a reliable bank of temporary staff that we can call upon. Temporary staff are often associated directly with the setting, so perhaps you might have a retired member of staff who is still able to work and might be able to provide some casual cover, or you might have, like I said earlier, some part-time staff who might be able to do some additional hours to cover. But some staff might be contracted as well for times in the day where greater support is required, for example, covering lunch breaks. They might operate on a 0 hours basis and provide support with greater flexibility. But also temporary staff can be sourced from external agencies. And many settings will have preferred agencies that they use on a regular basis. And indeed, within those agencies, they may even have preferred members of staff who might have provided cover in the past at your setting. And it might be that you request for them to return if that's possible. That's always really helpful if that's the case, as it means that any returning staff will already be familiar with your settings routines, the staff and the children that they are going to be working with as well. If you have appointed a temporary member of staff from an agency, they might be brand new to the nursery, and in which case it's vital that all necessary check-in procedures have taken place. Most agencies will usually carry out those checks for you, but it is important that you also follow the safety guidelines in line with your own safeguarding and recruitment policies at your setting. It's also really important to remember that any brand new member of temporary temporary member of staff in your setting will require an additional induction period where there are certain procedures you will need to make sure they are familiar with before you can make sure they can go and practice in your setting. It's also really important that we think about the experience that any of the temporary staff have to ensure that both the setting and that staff member are getting the most out of this experience. So, establish early doors if you can what their strengths are, and do try to make the best of these whilst they are in your setting or providing the cover within your provision. I'm going to pass on to Emily now, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of those benefits of temporary staff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I have a bit more of a personal slant on this because I actually started my early years career as a bank staff member in a local nursery, and that was where I fell in love with the whole experience, having a real range of being able to work with preschool and babies and everything in between and get a real variety on my own practice, as I was totally new to early years at the time. So I really have that kind of position to thank for being here today. There are a huge range of benefits to employing temporary staff. For those who have settings who manage their own team of bank staff members, they will be responsible for kind of that recruitment through to training. And there is a huge benefit to that in that all of those standard processes will be used alongside your permanent staff too. So there's a real consistency in how those procedures continue to support children throughout the setting. And as Sinead said, with agency staff, it's just important to ensure that that consistency remains, because we all know that settings operate differently. So it's really important to kind of keep that consistency there, and it does create a huge benefit for that wider team kind of morale. There are many reasons why individuals might choose to be in those bank positions, and I think a lot of the time there is a certain kind of perception that bank staff members are either less qualified or they are not kind of in the same role as a permanent staff member. But that's something that I'd really like to challenge today and get you to think about the kind of real basis on which bank staff work in their role, why they do it, but also why it's of a benefit to you in your setting. So for me personally, I was at university when I started my bank work. So I had a real flexibility in the hours that I could choose based on when I was in the city, when I was had other responsibilities going on. So for me, that bank staff worked purely from that basis. I was unqualified at the time, but it was also an opportunity that gave me an insight into early years that, had that position not been there, I wouldn't have known anything about. So actually for you as a setting, the benefits of having those temporary staff in get you a real feel for the talents that you see coming through the door, and often an opportunity to kind of propagate that talent, to get a real strong sense of bank staff members that will often go on to become permanent members in your setting if that relationship works well. But bank staff members might be qualified and they might be looking to vary their experiences. For example, if they're working somewhere else as well, they might be looking for something to bolster up a term time role if they're working outside of that kind of time setting, in a 365-day kind of nursery. But it might also be that they're studying as well. And it might be that actually that bank staff role is supporting their professional practice in something that they're working towards a higher qualification in. So in terms of professional development, that bank staff member is retaining a real sense of experience that they can then use to better their practice with you. Whatever the reasons, though, bank staff can bring a really dynamic approach to the work that they do, because they're supporting your teams by drawing on experiences that benefit everyone, whether that be from additional study, working in a different room or a different setting. It's all things that they can draw back upon to really kind of excel in their experience and provide novel things that maybe your permanent team haven't thought of. The main reason that settings draw upon bank staff members is obviously the huge benefit of meeting those legal ratios and supporting that team effectively when staffing is a little bit awry. This might seem more relevant for settings during popular times like we're coming into, where you might have staff members who want to take a little bit more of a leave during the Christmas period or during the summer holidays if they've got children who are in a school setting of their own. It might be that you have that commonality of February half terms, for example. Bank staff provisions can never be underestimated for the circumstances that are completely beyond our control. So where you do have that planned kind of holiday time, you will also have staff going home either at the start of the day and not not coming in because of illness or having to go home early because of illness or unexpected scenarios. And in those moments, bank staff are invaluable for their kind of saving grace, really, of being able to maintain those ratios and keep the provision safe for everybody. Having a bank team who are not around all of the time also really allows for a fresh pair of eyes to have a good kind of look and provide feedback on the experiences across setting. We all know that when we are in the same place every day, things can kind of become normalized and we don't necessarily question in the same critical eye as we might do entering a new setting. Taking those experiences and that feedback from bank staff members really gives you that asset of that novel eye and being able to see things that you might not have considered as they're part of your everyday. But you should also really use this experience as an opportunity to showcase your setting. Remember, these bank staff members, particularly if they're not just associated with your setting, they'll have the insight and the expertise of lots of different areas of setting provisions if they're going into different nurseries, for example, or they work in school settings as well. When I worked as bank staff, I was not only bank for one nursery setting, but I was bank for 2 nurseries and worked in wraparound care at a primary school. So I had a really good understanding of the kind of things that were provided in the local community. And I do feel that that gave me a bit of an advantage when it came to providing those ideas to benefit others. You may have a new member of staff in the setting that might go in and out of other settings, as I say. They might also work with families in the community as well. So you really want this person to think about what you offer as your provision being the best that there is. You want them to go into other settings and talk with others about how good you are and hopefully kind of propagate that sense of passion for them to keep returning to your setting as well as a workplace. But with that, there are also responsibilities on your leadership team to really think about the considerations for temporary staff as a very specialised area of staffing. For temporary staff, it can be difficult to jump straight into the flow of the other room, particularly if they haven't been in there for a while. It might be that they are new to the setting entirely, which causes a whole other range of considerations when it comes to explaining how processes work, not only across the setting, but the particulars of your age group and your room. Children change on a daily basis, so even if that bank staff member was in your room last week, it's really important to highlight any changes, significant or otherwise, that have been communicated either by parents and carers or other staff members to really ensure that consistency and confidence in all of the team that work with that child. This might relate to care-based routines, such as changes to nappy cream or changes to how we are looking at nap times, for example, but it might also be around preferences and developmental signs. There may be a cause for safeguarding as well to really kind of highlight where those needs for safety are integral to our practice, our education and care. It's really important to make sure that everyone who needs to be in the know is, regardless of whether they're there for one day or permanent basis. Balance this information to ensure that temporary staff know enough to be able to facilitate and support children effectively, but also particularly where it comes to safeguarding, making sure that that confidentiality is really enclosed and it's something that is not also going to overwhelm that staff member coming into a room and being told 20 things about 20 different children and it becoming quite an overstimulating aspect. Sometimes being out of a room for a while means that names can be forgotten as well, or parents and carers not recognised. So ensuring support is available and questions are encouraged by all staff members can really go a long way for making that temporary staff member feel welcome in the room, but also confident enough to practice in the way that they deem best. As a team, it's really important to support all temporary staff, and this can be done in numerous ways. Temporary staff are an asset to the early education and care sector, not only those who are qualified and continue to support in flexible ways, but also as a retainment strategy for bank staff members who might not be qualified or might not be as experienced yet, but are using this as a gateway into the profession. If we can provide a welcoming, supportive platform for those individuals to feel like this is a profession they want to spend the rest of their careers in, it works really well to kind of build up that sense of retainment of good staff. Working to support teams in the hours of need, they provide that additional support. It might be one-to-one cover, it might be when they're covering sickness, but it also makes it possible for all our hard-working permanent staff to take that well-deserved break, as we talked about earlier. But temporary staff's contributions can easily go unnoticed or taken for granted because they are the people that step into the room when they're needed and then sometimes disappear out of the limelight when they're not. And in the busy sector that we work in, it's easy to kind of take those moments for granted. We would recommend CPD for all. We know that continuing professional development is an essential part of ensuring that we are all developing our knowledge within our practice, and CPD should be made available for all staff. Temporary staff should be supported as any other member of staff is to build that better understanding and knowledge of those specific areas of interest, as well as that mandatory training requirement. We often see bank staff members being allowed to tick off those mandatory requirements such as your safeguarding and food hygiene, but are sometimes left out of the CPD that looks at more of the development of practice and that development of skill sets. By paying in extra resources and time to those temporary staff, you're allowing them to build up a continued sense of progression, a deeper sense of belonging, and really sending that message that you value them, which goes a long way not only to their sense of self, but also the retainment of them in your setting. Supporting temporary staff to gain experience across the setting is something that we would also perceive to be continued development, but also something that helps us to share that workload, because it's often seen that temporary staff, because of their position, they might be more involved in some of the more kind of trivial, we would deem trivial parts of the day, such as mopping up food. They might be the ones that take out the bins, those kind of activities that can actually, whilst they are super valuable, if you're doing that day in, day out, and you don't have time to interact with the children, the reason that you're in that role, it can be quite challenging to maintain that motivation and enthusiasm for the space. So in this respect, we'd really like to even that workload out. And whilst there are elements where permanent staff might be preferred, such as for care routines of an intimate nature or for handovers to parents and carers, temporary staff should be encouraged to also spend as much time with the children as possible. So whilst they are often designated those roles such as tidying the garden or clearing away food after meal times, it's important that we ensure that they are able to take that balance between those tasks that we deem to be essential, but also then the opportunities to build those meaningful relationships with children, engaging in that play, supporting learning, and also supporting their own development as a professional. Because without those experiences, how are we expecting them to progress? But lastly, consistency is key when it comes to learning. We grow in confidence by feeling familiar and extending our capacities after a set of time, if that's playing with the children in a certain area, or even something as simple as knowing where the bin key is kept. That familiarity in setting really kind of helps to promote that sense of self and that sense of value. Try to ensure consistency for newer staff members, particularly so that they can gain a good understanding of the environment and its expectations, because we know that each room will operate differently. So it's important to kind of support those niches so that those staff members can move towards working into a different room with a level of confidence that helps their sense of professionalism.
Thanks, Emily. I think what you've said there's a few things that really resonated with me there when we're talking about how we make our staff feel welcome. I think firstly, that whole the idea of value is so important, and you hit on it a few times there, to sort of, we value these new people joining us, particularly if we're thinking about, perhaps somebody joining from an agency that's brand new. We need to make those people feel valued. We never know what other longer term opportunities might arise in our setting. So if they feel valued and they've had a positive experience, they might be likely to then apply and then could become a permanent member in the future. And that whole idea of, what you said there about making sure that we give them roles, not just the auxiliary tasks like the mopping up or the standard day-to-day tasks that do need to take place, and obviously we all do that, but rather than making them feel that that's all that they are kind of valuable for, making sure that they are engaging with the children and doing the same rich interactions that you would expect from all the consistent members of staff. I think that sort of speaks to them. And that idea as well, if it's somebody that's going to be a little bit longer term, or not even long term, but kind of beyond a week, that there's CPD opportunities and you're more than welcome to join in with them as well. That's really kind of showing that value and speaking to making them feel welcome.
Absolutely. And I think part of that goes to my final kind of comment on it is that bank staff members are still working in early education and care for a reason. They are passionate about the children, they are passionate about the play and the learning and the development and care that all takes place. It's just that their role looks slightly different to a 40-hour week on a permanent basis. And that might be for their own needs, it might be for the nursery and settings needs itself. And actually, we should value those individuals who don't necessarily have the same structured routine of work pattern each week, because they play a massive part in how our settings succeed.
Yeah, I know that from my own experience, thinking of when I've done some cover work in settings, how one of the places I worked in, it was put into the newsletter that I was going to be. It was a bit more pre-planned. It wasn't just on the morning that I got called to go. Um, and it was communicated to parents that I would be joining. And
That goes a long way
that,
too.
yeah, that made it made me feel like I had a place in the setting, and it made me want to be there for longer. And I took the role. Obviously, I take any role seriously, but I really invested in that role. And so it's just simple things like that, even at the end of the day, obviously we would rely on the more permanent members of staff to be doing the handover at the end of the day. But if the bank member of staff, or that newer member of staff is there present, just to take the time to do a brief introduction. Oh, we've had Emily in the setting with us today, and she might be
Yeah.
back tomorrow, or perhaps we might see her
Mhm.
again, and just sort of keeping it so that you're really thinking about making that person feel valued, because you want it. It can be stressful sometimes, the whole experience of having to rely on bank staff. It can be difficult for the member of staff. It can be difficult for the setting for different reasons, but trying to make it as positive as possible is really important. Um, and that, there's just a few things just to think about in terms of our next steps. Obviously the key thing is safety as well for the children that we're working with. So always making sure that we ensure that any temporary cover in our settings, that they've met all the legal criteria in line with safer recruitment guidelines and EYFS requirements, and that any necessary checks from the settings part have taken place. And that's obviously crucial. But thinking as well to review your own current practice when you are welcoming a new member into the setting, or perhaps a member that's covering from another room, like you've said. But thinking about, what procedures do you have to make that person feel welcome, to give them that brief induction, making sure that they're informed on a need to know basis about the needs of the different children in that room. Um, do you have any little systems in place? So again, I've worked somewhere in the past where we were given a lanyard, and it had all of the key procedures were on little laminate cards that were attached to the lanyards. Not too cumbersome, but really effective for me. I knew that, like, the routines was listed on one of the cards, and it was a go-to. So just thinking about what measures do you have in place that keep it straightforward, and also straightforward and simple for the consistent members of staff that are in that room as well at that time. I think another useful thing I would say is to perhaps provide opportunities for temporary staff to give you some feedback or offer suggestions. You said it before, Emily, sometimes people come from other settings and they've got so many ideas that they want to share, but they might not feel brave enough to speak up and say it, for fear
Mhm.
that, the setting manager might think that they're being critical by suggesting that, the practice isn't good here, but it is in a nursery down the road. But actually offering those members of staff the opportunity to give some feedback or offer suggestions. Who knows what you might hear? There could be a wealth of things there. So that's really important as well. So it might be something you might want to allocate at the end of the day, or just have a kind of casual conversation. And another thing I would say from my experience as well is just to keep a track of those strong bank members that you've had that have come into play, because the next time you might be calling an agency, if they've made a good impact and a good impression on their day with you, you might want to ask for them to return. Or again, if you've got some longer job opportunities that are coming up in the future, it might be that there's an opportunity to contact and reach out to them for future work. Um, but just to sort of tie this in as well, is just to take some time, I would say, to think about your team currently, and how are you using temporary staff within your setting, and how are they being supported from the wider team, and supporting each other whilst they are with you. And just as a little question just to pose and think of before we sign off, just What one change could you make to benefit temporary staff within your setting and the whole experience of when we need to call on temporary staff? So that might be something that you just want to reflect on and think about at the end of watching this session. And then finally, your other next steps is just for you to remember as a member, you can log your CPD points on your CPD profile on the platform. And also, if you haven't already, you might want to take the chance to book your place on our next webinar, which is coming up next Wednesday, the 11th of December at 12 o'clock. Taking a slightly different angle for next week and thinking about how we can use process-based crafts in the settings and do that really effectively. So slightly different for the next session. And then finally, just if you get a chance to visit the forum, our forum is there and you are welcome to put any comments or feedback or ask questions related to this and or other topics that you might be browsing on the website as well. So do share your thoughts and experiences with those like-minded professionals in our member exclusive forum. And that is it from us for this webinar. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Emily, for sharing your insights. We
Thank
look
you.
forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.